a number of sociologists have been very engaged with the impact of COVID measures. Is that where it started, that your area of expertise as an academic caused you to be concerned about some of the impacts of lockdowns?
Yes, really. I mean, both as an academic and also as a parent. So I wrote the Corona Generation book with my teenage daughter in spring 2020. She'd just had her GCSEs cancelled. She wasn't sure what to do with herself. And my research area as a sociologist is generations, and generational tensions, generational consciousness. So it struck me right at the start that this was going to be a very big issue with the pandemic. And as a sociologist, what are you supposed to do? We're supposed to look at the social world. This was obviously a very big thing. So it became something that was very absorbing for me, both academically, but also, personally.
And was it therapeutic to write the book with your daughter? Did it help both of you to work through some of the issues that many families have been presented with?
Yeah, I mean, latterly, I suppose.
Did you write it angrily?
Well, no, because it was, we were writing in April, May largely, and then we finished it in June. And at that time, everything was very new, everything was still unravelling. And we were really both trying to make sense of it in our own way. So Emma, my daughter, was trying to make sense of what it was like for her and her friends, where suddenly they'd been going for something, moving towards a future, and suddenly it kind of collapsed in that sense of, people being scared of them as young people, and this kind of, there's a bit in the book where she talks about waking up in a dystopia, which I think was an experience for a lot of people. And for me, it was very challenging, because normally as an academic, you're writing about something that's happened. You've got the benefit of hindsight, whereas this was as things were going along, as things were unravelling.
Yes, and I took a very tearful call to this programme just before the winter lockdown in December. And the reason why this chap was so tearful and upset was not that he was actually going to be financially impacted by that most recent lockdown, but a sense that this will never end. And I think that's a very perennial theme. I think human beings can handle short-term pain and suffering. Yeah. But one of the problems with the pandemic is a sense that we'll never escape this.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's why, that was certainly my sense when it first happened, that what was happening was so big and so unprecedented, and so much was at stake that, I didn't think, 3 weeks it'll all be over, or,
So you didn't buy 3 weeks to flatten the curve?
No, but I didn't know what was going to happen with the virus, and it wasn't implausible to think, well, by the time we got to the summer, as we finished the book, and this was last summer, things kind of starting to open up again and feel a bit more normal. And you were thinking, you're very mindful of not sort of staying in mental lockdown forever just because you'd been obsessed with it. But I have to say, I wasn't surprised then when the whole thing went back again in the autumn and then the beginning of this year, because the script had been laid down, if you like, that this is how we respond to a pandemic, even though we have never, as a human society, responded to a pandemic like this before. So I think it's very disturbing, but I think it does indicate why this is so sociologically important for us to understand.
And your area of expertise is education, and we've seen school closures, which has been, really devastating for many children and families. But now they continue to be at school, and they have the sword of Damocles hanging over them, which is to get pinged, or, well, not quite pinged, but emailed by the head teacher saying that someone has tested positive for COVID and they've got to go home. And we're looking at hundreds of thousands of children at the moment sat at home. They may well not have COVID, but they're majorly missing out.
Yes, I think for me, one of the most disturbing aspects of this pandemic has been the way that we as adults have behaved with children. They are, we've treated them, and again we wrote about this last spring. We've treated them like vectors for infection, not as human beings for whom we've got a responsibility. We've tried to protect ourselves from them. We haven't taken education seriously, and by that I mean I feel very, very sorry for teachers who I think are trying their best in very difficult circumstances, and schools trying to work around it. But schools aren't supposed to be outposts of public health, and they've been kind of reduced to that. And even that sense of educational continuity, like being able to stay in school all term, has been disrupted for kids. And so, there's that terrible insecurity of what happens if you suddenly you're identified as a close contact, or your bubble closes, or, you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, what, Jenny, does it say about society's attitude to children and young people that we have allowed them to be so impacted by the COVID measures? You know, it's not compelling that schools had to actually close, and we saw that Sweden kept their schools open. Florida, for certainly the best part of 10 months now, have had the schools open. Even France have had schools open since January. So what does it say about a society that we're so willing to neglect the impact on children in our appraisal of measures?
Well, a few quite disturbing things, I think. I mean, to me, it does reveal that all the mantra that we were hearing right up until when the pandemic broke about the children of the future, listen to the children, we need youth voices. Do you remember that?
Yes.
You know, it was never genuine. Now, that didn't surprise me because I never really thought it was. I mean, I think children have been used as a cover in many different ways and used quite cynically. The voice of youth is usually somebody else's voice put into the mouth of young people. And that's what my previous research on generations has kind of has sought to show. But it was quite shocking to see it so brutally exposed. And
wasn't the low point face coverings in the classroom, given the fact that, to be polite, the science around the efficacy of face masks is debatable at best, and therefore to mandate it on children as young as 12 all day long in the classroom, if it's not definitively effective, is completely unacceptable, especially for a group in the population who face no mortal threat from the disease. For me, the masks in the classroom was a true low point.
Yes, although for me it was one of many, actually. I think there's been so many low points in schools, and what distresses me about what's happened to schools is it's almost like as things have become more uncertain, as we as a society become more uncertain what to do about this pandemic, it's kind of focused on kids because they have no power, right? They're in school. We can just do these things to them and we can enforce it, even when there's no benefit to it. I mean, the maths in class thing, I do think it was very bad.
Well, I'm gonna, but you're very temperate in your language in the articles I've read on Collateral Global, which we'll come to. But I consider face coverings on children, given the debatable scientific advantage, as an assault on children.
I think any educator worth their salt would question the value of, I mean, there's not only I think the whole thing was a kind of, I'll call it performative sociologically. It was a performance of something that wasn't going to have any clinical benefit. I think the health impacts on children were probably quite bad, but hey, no one ever really sought to look at those.
Yeah.
But as an educator, when children have to see your faces, they're supposed to be listening to you. Communication is about what education's about. I got quite good when I was teaching on campus university students in the autumn of kind of reading eyebrows. I was at least at least I had the students in the class, but that thing about not being able to see students' expressions, not being able to encourage discussion and communication, then you think, well, what is education about then if we're prepared to just take that away through this kind of gesture of doing something,
being seen to do something? And I think my view, and I mentioned it on yesterday's show, is that the face coverings are rooted in behavioural science rather than disease control, and it's a signal to the public that we're in a pandemic. That's my view. Some professionals and some scientists think that the masks are great and are worth the potential downsides, but the bottom line is, and I think here's the kicker, it's got to be personal choice. If the evidence around something like face coverings as a measure is not overwhelmingly clear, you can't mandate it. That's the point.
Yes, and I think there was a real thoughtlessness through which the transition was made from, for example, people needing to wear a mask when they went to the supermarket to children having to sit in a class for 6 hours a day wearing a mask. These are completely different scenarios.
We make that leap? And unfortunately, it's because the measures have become normalised, and now there are people talking about continuing to impose these measures upon themselves. An amazing story from Sainsbury's, which, by the way, is a supermarket I like and I use. There's one around the corner, very good value. But they just published, they tweeted out yesterday that they're going to lift the mask mandate on the 19th of July. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, yeah, in parallel with the actual law.
Yes.
It's like, well, thanks so much for granting us those freedoms that we actually have. And you wonder about the overreach of corporations, but we'll get to that. Collateral Global, a remarkable website, a journalistic resource, created by scientists and medics of world renowned who are concerned by the impact of COVID measures. They're not necessarily anti-vaxxers or even anti-lockdown, but they just want a debate about whether this was really worth the pain that was caused.
Yes, and importantly to take stock of this so we know for the future, because of course the thing about lockdown was that it was never planned, it was never modelled. It kind of went in the face of actually what the general plan was.
4 decades of pandemic planning, which
Yeah.
I think a few territories, including Sweden, adhered to, which is to protect the vulnerable and let the young and healthy go about their lives and take sensible precautions, and for things like face coverings and distancing to be voluntary.
Yes, broadly. And
a lot of Swedish people did stay home, especially if they thought they were vulnerable. Some people wore masks, but it was left to the people to decide. And now you've got a population in Sweden who are not cowering with fear, thinking that this is the bubonic plague.
Well, quite. And, you know, I mean, I'm a social policy scholar as well as a sociologist. I do think governments have responsibilities in these circumstances to do their best to protect their populations. But obviously what we did with lockdown was we didn't protect the vulnerable. You know, the lockdown was something else. And I think, you know, it was fairly obvious from the start that this would have negative consequences. You know, you didn't really need a model to say, well, what happens? You know, okay, people talk about furlough. Oh, well, furlough was great. People were allowed to kind of just not go to work for ages. Well, first of all, that's not necessarily a good thing. Second of all, 80% of your wages is not 100% of your wages.
Correct.
Something that people forget. What happens to people across the world? You know, when you can't furlough a supply chain, okay? So if you're not selling clothes for 4 months, what happens to the people who make those clothes or whatever? We didn't even seem to consider these consequences.
And of course, another scandal for me is the national debt, because it's future generations who will be paying for this policy. I mean, people have been paid to stay at home, and it runs to the tune of billions. In fact, the national debt may touch 3 trillion by the time we're done with this. So, you know, we've seen so many measures. I don't think there are any people out there who sort of set about to destroy the economy or destroy the country. I suspect that politicians and sage scientists panicked, and that's probably a conversation for another day. But what are the key reasons why you got involved in Collateral Global? And just tell me about the website in the short minutes we have left.
Because I think it's very important to acknowledge the damage that has been done by some of these restrictions, which has, you know, in the context of panic, as you're talking about, I agree with you. I don't think it was a planned destruction of society. But it's very important that this stuff is noted and tracked and talked about, because I don't think we can assume it won't happen again. And that's, I think, the important thing. And it's also only by acknowledging what we've lost over the past year and a bit, nearly year and a half, that we can really have a conversation about what we value and what we want to get back to. You know, and that's something that I feel very keenly, that it's almost like you stop being able to imagine what it was like to, I don't know, at a time it was to just kind of see your family or hug people or go on holiday, or assume that when your kids go to school, they'll stay there for the rest of the term. Assume that when your kids have spent 2 years working towards formal exams, that those exams will actually happen. Assume that as a university lecturer, you're allowed to go and teach your actual students. That's your job. And I think it's those kind of, that sense of just really reckoning that this was a big deal. I mean, it still is, actually. It's, certain aspects
And of course, the more
ongoing.
we inform ourselves, I mean, I've said on this programme that I hope the measures were the right thing to do. You know, I'm not one of those broadcasters that paints themselves into a corner. If I'm wrong, I'll be like, wow, I've looked at the figures, lockdowns really saved lives. But of course, the early data doesn't look fantastic. Do you have the impression that in the end, common sense will prevail, that particularly when the British people taste freedom again on the 19th of July, that we will start to look in a dispassionate way at the societal, economic and health damage, and that we won't do this again? Because I suspect that once we are free, the genie's out the lamp, and I don't think we'll have lockdowns again. That's my belief.
Well, that is an interesting question.
Here's hoping.
Here's hoping. On one level, I think that's already happened, in the sense that I think people
it's going to
are
happen
aware
it's
of this.
going to happen tonight at 8:00 when England score, isn't it?
Yeah. But, you know, Collateral Global is a public-facing organisation. It's not for a small little cabal of academics, because I think a lot of people are talking about those issues. The gap, though, is with politicians, policymakers, the media class, if you like, where often a very different discussion seems to be taking place. And it's really about how we kind of bring back that public discussion of what we want from our lives and how to manage these things
and
better.
for politicians, being sympathetic for a nanosecond, not to feel like they have to be seen to do something.
Yes.
Because my view is that the mask mandate was also a way of the government saying, look, we're doing something.
Yeah.
I mean, you could obviously wear underpants on your head, and that's a measure.
Maybe we should try
Will
that.
it work? Well, I've been doing it on the tube, and they don't like it. But also lockdowns. And final thought, I think what's important about Collateral Global, which, by the way, I mean, it's got people like Professor Jay Bhattacharya, who I think it's fair to say is one of the most respected infectious disease experts in the world. He's not some crackpot anti-vaxxer. In fact, he's pro-vaccine. Sunetra Gupta, many other illustrious people, and yourself included. But if we sort of think about the future and the issue you have with lockdowns and face masks is, on paper, they make a lot of sense. And I think that's why they're so dangerous. Because I think it's logical for an infectious virus like COVID to stay home and to cover your face. It's just that the science isn't really there to back it up. And now the numbers, if you look at countries that locked down hard versus others that didn't, it doesn't stack up. So I think that for me, the danger of lockdowns and masks is it's a quick fix for politicians to be seen to do something, but whether it works is another question.
Yes, but I mean, it's interesting what you say there, because in a sense, the thing that is logical, as you said, is that new dangerous virus, people don't know about it, people aren't immune to it, so they're likely to keep their distance, they're not going to go and visit their elderly relatives. They would do that anyway. You didn't need a lockdown to do the sensible things that lockdown brought. This is the question: why?
on steak night, even though I love the sirloin, if I've got the flu, because I'll stay in bed.
Yeah. So why was it that the government saw the need to bring in laws and restrictions and a whole load of really unhelpful guilt tripping and moralising and everything else to reinforce what people were doing anyway? That's the thing that doesn't make sense, and I think it's that's really the confusion that's been created by this past year or so.